And now people can see and hear us again. And y'all talk.
One at a time.
Tracy, say something.
Something.
David?
Tracy said.
I'll just follow Tracy with something.
The waveforms in OBS are a lot smoother right now, so I'm hoping that it comes across the stream better now, too. Should I start over from the beginning? Let's not do that. Let's just go from...
You were recording the audio the whole time,
yeah,
right?
the audio is still recording. We're on minute 12 already.
Yeah.
All right. AlphaStream says it looks and sounds great now. Yay!
Perfect.
Thank y'all for letting us know. I continue to fight technology because that's the world we live in.
Yep, it certainly is.
Okay. So we were discussing whether or not we were going to start over from the beginning or just start from me talking about where I'm at. And I think we're just going to ignore that the YouTube video may suffer for a lack of introduction because the audio should be fine on the podcast. So we're just going to go ahead and pick up from my talking about my journey, I guess. So I was saying that my goals for the last month were to not weigh in for 2 months per David's recommendation, and to try to get my slow running up to a 16-minute mile for as many runs as I could handle. And to some degree, I guess one could say that I have been successful on both counts. There have been several times that I just sort of instinctually was in the bathroom waiting for the shower to warm up and thinking, oh, maybe I'll go hop on the scale now real quick and check in. And then I remembered, David said 2 months. So I won't be able to record in and tell you how my weight is doing until the next episode that we record at the end of July. And my running has I did and I think y'all were mentioned in the tweet that I sent, but I did have a run where I hit less than a 16-minute mile. It is the
Congratulations.
It is the only run that I've had that was less than a 16-minute mile since last month, since we last chatted. I'm gonna take it as a victory, but a mitigated victory, if you will.
That feels like you hit the goal. Your goal was to get below that 16-minute. You did that.
Yeah.
The beginning of the next step.
That's right. Yeah. So part of the trick is that, and this has happened before where I've tried running, and eventually my interest starts to wane and the boredom for running sets in, and I kind of really desperately wish I could go to the gym 2 or 3 times a week and run a couple times a week and call that good, and just to break it up a little bit, and that's not an option at the moment. And honestly, I've gone from 3 days a week running, and the last few weeks, for different reasons each week, but I have to assume that part of it is motivation, I've gone down to 2 times a week in terms of running. I'm sure, there's other reasons, but I'm sure if the motivation wasn't a thing, I could have prioritized it and made it happen. But I didn't. And honestly, there's been days like today where it's like I just really wasn't feeling it. I didn't want to go out and run. But my youngest son has been running with me sometimes, and he was asking if we were going to go, and I knew that we were going to be chatting about it tonight. And so I made it a point to go out and run to make sure that I keep getting in my minimum 2 times a week. Because and this is positive for the show anyway, right? Part of, I think, the goal that we talked about when we started this whole thing was that hopefully it would motivate us to make good choices, and I think that worked, right? I did not want to make good choices today, but I did because I knew I'd have to talk to you all about it. So that
there's something to be said for accountability. It's always a fine line in the industry. The fitness industry has run a lot on shame and guilt, and we talked about that previously, I think. But there's a difference between shame and guilt and accountability. Having holding yourself accountable, or having friends or circumstances that hold you accountable. And it's the point of accountability is to help. You were talking about motivation, to help motivate you toward the success of your goals. If you want to, you'd celebrate the successes as you get them, even if they're small. And if you've got partners or some way to hold yourself accountable, if that's what it needs to motivate you, there's nothing wrong with that. That can be very positive, as long as you're not falling into the shame spiral, which I think we can probably all agree is less healthy for you overall. Even if it gets you out on the road, what it does to your mental state and your body in the long term is not worth it.
So that's been my month, and thank you for the words of encouragement there. Who wants to talk about their goals for the last month now? Any volunteers?
Let's let David go.
Yeah, I can say my primary thing we talked about last time is I'm working on cutting not sugar entirely, but excess sugar out of my diet. I have a bad sweet tooth. Bad is not the wrong word. I have a serious sweet tooth. I'm kind of a candy junkie, and in this times when I think we're all finding the whatever way we can to comfort ourselves, I had ratcheted my sugar, my candy intake, candy and cookies and donuts and those kinds of things to a catastrophic level for myself. So, and my doctor agreed after seeing my blood work. And so I had been continuing to remove as much of that from my diet as I could. And I'm doing pretty well with that. I still, it's important. I have found it important in my fitness journey not to deny myself anything. That creates a bad spiral. But I have brought the candy and donut intake down to, I think, a very manageable level, and we'll see next month with my blood work what that if that's helped. But that's gone pretty well. My weekly workouts have been okay. I am at an advantage from that. Obviously, I am, and though we're not open because it's not safe, my office is next to a gym, so it is very easy for me, even when I'm feeling unmotivated, to walk over and crank out a little bit of something. So I've been consistent there, but the sugar has been. I feel good about it. I feel good about where I am in the progress.
Nice. So I'd like to hear from Tracy now, if she's okay with that.
Sure. So I don't even remember what I had. It seems so long ago. A month.
It does, right?
Man, this month has been several years, right?
Yeah. And I think it was mostly around, again, the blood sugar and increasing my activity. I honestly didn't test as much. So the big thing was I had gone to my parents, which helped in other ways because they're taking on some of the childcare duties during the day, which reduces my stress level, which is great, and also gives me an opportunity to walk most days. So I'm going to take that as a big win. And we're also trying to get a house closer to them. So there's been a lot of additional stuff around there. But on the flip side, the way I'm helping them is by doing some of the yard work and stuff like that, because the main reason we're moving is they're getting older and have mobility issues. So I've been getting a lot more chore type exercise, which counts. So, scrubbing the floor and moving stuff around the yard. And there's going to be even more of that in my future. So that's my check-in.
That's great. And I think the way that you're approaching the additional movement by incorporating it into the natural rhythm of your life, that's only going to be positive.
Yeah, and my hope is when we get our place and move there, that I'll be able to do even more of that, because I can now we'll have almost a whole acre, so I can plant whatever I want and stuff like that. So that'll be awesome. And then I did check with my weight, and I'm slight down, so I'll just call it a plateau. I don't overly, I'm not overly picky there, but hey, middle of pandemic, people want to chow down a lot. I was able to stay where I was. I still think that's pretty awesome.
Anything beyond survival's a win. That sounds really great to me.
Fantastic. Yeah. All right, Sam. So how are you doing this month?
I'm doing okay. I'm still having some I guess it would fall under the category of anxiety and depression. Not in a clinical sense. I'm not. I am not. I've not been, diagnosed with any sort of clinical depression. But I, I know my own moods, and I am at the point where I have been in a relatively bad mood for the past, few days or week or so. And knowing that I don't like that. And so I've tried to do things that are active in order to get myself out of that because I know that works for me. Um, but there is just a psychic oppression that is happening in the world right now, and it's difficult for me right now personally because things going on at my job are not really set in stone, and there's a little bit of uncertainty there, and I really don't like that. Um, but so that's the sort of background to what's happening in my life. But on the other hand, so I took David and Jeff's suggestions to heart last time, which was don't weigh yourself. So I stopped weighing myself every day. And I'm not really watching my diet, but what I've started doing is I've started doing 14-hour fasts to work up to a 24, 36-hour fasting regime. And I just started that about a week and a half ago, and I can already tell that my body deals with the food that I eat after the fast is over. My body deals with the food a little bit differently. Um, and I'm saying that in a neutral way because this is all new to me, so I'm sort of still trying to weigh how, like, am I okay with that, and what do I think is going on, and all that stuff. It's all brand new, so I'm kind of just paying attention to that and kind of keeping notes to myself about, well, here's what happened, when I fasted for this long, and here's, that sort of thing. But I have been sleeping better for the past 2 or 3 days, which, if you recall, is actually my main goal, which is to improve my sleep overall for a more long-term sort of outlook. And so that's a good thing. So I think I'm making progress. It's tiny baby steps, but I'm okay with that. So
Slow progress is progress that lasts.
right, exactly.
Right.
Well, it's like Jeff running you hit the 16-minute mile one time, right? But you have to hit it one time before you can hit it two times, and you have to hit it two times before you can hit it every time, right? Like
Yeah.
that's kind of how I'm approaching it too. Like I'm I'm doing 14-hour fasts, and when we talk about the book, we'll find out why maybe that's not exactly perfect, but it is what it is, and I have to do that before I can do the 24. I know myself, and so that's so there you go.
Well,
Can I ask you guys?
Yeah.
So you all talked about your goals and sort of where you are in relation to your goals objectively.
Mhm.
I'm just curious. I didn't hear any of you talk about how you feel, and I'm just wondering. I mean, obviously, external forces are causing situational depression, like you were talking about, Sam, and we've all got heightened anxiety, and Tracy's getting ready to move, and you've all got kids to manage, and talking about going back to school has got to be fraught for those of you who are teachers. So trying to correct for all of that may be hard, but are your bodies feeling different under these kind of changes that you're making in your lives?
Yeah.
I mean, it's okay if the answer is no. I'm curious.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sam.
It's different, but not. But like I say, I can tell that it's different, but I'm not because it's new. I'm not quite comfortable enough to say it feels really good yet.
Sure.
So yes, different, but I'm still I know that the same thing happens to me when I start a workout regime. I know myself, and I feel really good when I do a really good workout. But if I ramp up to that too fast, I burn out real quick, and the feel good feeling goes away, and that makes me burn out, right? So I'm trying to be very slow up the hill versus gung ho, let me go all in 100%. I'm going to change everything right now. I'm going to feel wonderful for 2 weeks, and then I'm going to crash because so yeah, I feel different, but I'm I haven't really assessed it fully yet. I'll put it that way.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and in terms of and this is where I appreciate the encouraging words about I hit that 16-minute mile mark, but that was also 3 weeks ago, and I was hoping that I was on a path of improvement. So like I take that to heart. Like I did accomplish that, and that is meaningful. It is a little disappointing that like this morning, usually with like my first mile, because usually my runs are 3-ish miles. Usually the first mile I'm under the 60-minute mark, and then it's the second and third where I start to fall apart. This morning my first mile wasn't even under 60 minutes. I was just really having a hard time getting moving, and that's been consistent. Like I haven't continued to progress, and I guess maybe that's part of where my motivation is. Maybe my motivation is also feeding into that. Maybe I'm performing less well because I'm not as motivated to even be out there doing it. I know that I've been having issues with my hip as well since I've been running more, so it's always a little slow getting going until that loosens up and what have you. But otherwise, things feel fine. I'm sort of keeping on, and trying to keep it all together, and being really curious how I'm going to keep all this going once the school year starts again. And there's some anxiety for that as well, because it's hard. I was trying really hard to get to the gym 3 times a week and do my full-time job, and have 2 kids and do a podcast on all this, so that's tough enough. But if I'm adding an hour of running a couple times a week on top of all of that, then I'm a little anxious about how sustainable this is all going to be once I feel safe going back to the gym. My gym is open, but they've allowed us to put a freeze on our account because we don't feel okay about the idea of going to the gym at this point. We're one of the counties in the state that still has significantly rising numbers, so it seems premature to have the gym open, so we decided not to go back. So, but yeah, so I feel about, I don't know. I don't know that I feel like I feel like I'm definitely faster. Like I feel like I'm a better runner, even if I haven't gained a lot of speed. I remember when I first started the program that I did at the beginning, which was basically like a couch to 5K that Zombies Run has. They have their own 5K program, and it starts off with like walk for 2 minutes and run for 15 seconds, and you slowly work your way up to running most of the time. And I was really slow then, and I was struggling to run 15 seconds every 2 minutes, so the fact that I go out for an hour-long run and I walk maybe, I don't know, 10 minutes of the whole run, that in general is a big victory to me, so it's not a fast run, but it's running, so. But yeah, so that's where I'm at. Tracy, how do you feel about your situation?
So, and this one's hard for me because part of the reason we ended up doing this was back in January was when I made a big change in terms of taking things more seriously, I guess, trying to address the blood sugar issues, stuff like that. And I'd gotten a really good rhythm going, and then March, everything hits. And now there's potentially, everyone takes this from their point of view, but from my point of view, I need to make long-term structural changes, given that I don't know how soon, that my child can go back to school, and we're still going to work both full-time jobs and things like that. So now it's more, instead of focusing the energy in the way that I had been in terms of figuring workouts and stuff like that, it's really more, how do I get these structural changes in so then I can create the new routine later. But it is kind of sad because I had, and I usually don't like to talk about numbers only, so just sure. In case there's anyone who's sensitive to it, I lost like 20 pounds from January to basically April. And now to be on a plateau is like, I'm glad just to be on the plateau. But it's hard to have, and probably we'll talk about this with the book too, right? Like it's hard to have that continuing downwards without any plateaus, which is fine, and everything. But it is a little interesting, and I also have going back to the shame thing, like I'm not doing it right now, but I know I have a tendency to be like a perfectionist and an overachiever and blah 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 blah, so I'm doing my best not to fall into that pattern too, which Sam, you're talking about doing the 14-hour fast, and that's like where I was last time when we talked. And I have been progressing more to the 18 and 19-hour ones, and I felt that it's really helped me because I no longer have to worry so much about making sure I only eat the quote-unquote right things or be controlling in that way. It's just like, hey, I can, if I want a few potato chips, whatever, like, I'm not gonna eat the whole bag, but I'm not gonna, afterwards say that I was bad or any of those negative type things about it. And then if I don't make an 18-hour fast, no big deal. There's another day, there's another opportunity the next day, which I found extremely helpful for me.
Nice.
So
That's
I know
awesome.
that's still not a lot about emotions, but it's a little bit more
Well,
about
it's partly emotion. It's probably how your body feels. It's probably how you feel. The reason I ask is, so I don't want to. Obviously, I'm not your guys' coach. I don't want to pretend I'm anybody's coach. I don't know everybody's detailed situations. I know you guys a little bit, but I found it interesting that there was a lot of objective talk about goals, but not a lot about how your body feels or how you emotionally feel or anything. And I think, especially in times like this, and I'm not a psychologist or anything, but I am somebody who suffers from chronic depression, and I've had plenty of time in therapy. And one of the things that you're in a depressed state or a high anxiety state, which have some of the same effects on our bodies, or whether it's situational depression or whatever, is a little bit of sort of numbness to the way we feel emotionally, physically, to ourselves, a decreased attention to the response of our bodies and our hearts and our minds. And I think dealing with objective stuff is a good way to continue your progress and stuff, but it's also important, I think, to continue to check in with yourself in other ways. You may not lose a pound, but you might feel better. You may not be as fast as you want to be, but you might realize that your progress has been strong. You might be plateauing in your weight loss goals, but you're, as you're saying, you're happy with in this circumstance, a plateau is a triumph. It's and so letting yourself examine in that way so that you can find your personal successes, and even if you have to force yourself to celebrate them a little bit, a smile is still a smile, and it still releases, it still changes your body in certain ways. And I think it helps us push through, especially when the world is fucking on fire, which is what's happening right now.
Yeah,
So
well, because it's even amazing in terms of it's like there's obviously like the changes in work from home and responsibilities and stuff like that, but it's even as mundane. Like, so I really enjoy eating like a lower carb, high vegetable, some fruit diet, but right now a lot of that is predicated on plentiful fresh fruits and vegetables, which our stores still have a lot, but that stuff I've also bought lettuce and had to go bad within a few days. So and so those are sorts of things that are like, just it's hard to keep. It feels like we're constantly pivoting to deal with everything that's happening. So yeah.
Yeah,
and when you're working through the executive dysfunction of depression, every obstacle is twice as tall as it was previously, and that's a very real feeling when you're dealing, again, whether it's situational or chronic. That is a real thing. The obstacles put in your path become more difficult to overcome, which just means they require a lot more energy, a lot more emotional energy, a lot more physical energy.
Well, and so this brings me to something I wanted to say to you, David, because I noticed that after Jeff talked, you gave him a little pep talk, and after I talked, you gave me a little pep talk, and after Tracy talked, you gave. But none of us gave you a pep talk. So I want to say something to you. And what I want to say to you is, you downplayed the fact that you could walk next door, because your office is next to the gym, that you could walk next door and work out. So you kind of said, it's not that big a deal. Bullshit, dude. It is a big deal. Because the fact of the matter is, even though it's right next door, you have to use your own motivation to get over there and do it, regardless of how far away it is, or the fact that you're in a position that you can actually use the gym, unlike Jeff. Like, that's a separate thing. You still had to move your feet over to the gym and work out. So don't downplay that. That is big kudos to you, because that's awesome.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam. That's an astute observation, and I appreciate that.
And you asked each of us sort of how we felt. So why don't you take a turn as well? How do you, after having successfully reduced your sort of sweets intake, how do you feel? How does your body feel? How do you feel?
my body feeling, I feel better. I like, as I said, I had there's so many negative connotations around this, but I had, because of how I comfort myself, I had put myself into a bad place medically, and I can tell the difference how my body feels in the reduction of sugar and stuff. I have found an interesting thing too. I've become, over the last few years, pretty good at listening to my body. When I listen, I feel it. And listening to my body again over the past couple of months, as I have been, I have learned. My body has changed how it responds to some of the foods that I love. Part of it's aging. I just turned 47. Part of it is life and circumstance. But I feel generally better. But I have found that I can't eat a whole bunch of bread or drink a beer or have anything with a lot of wheat in it after about 6 o'clock at night anymore. And that's a discovery I have made. Or I can do it. I just have a rough time sleeping and my body feels gross. So I feel better from reducing the sugar, and I've also started reducing. I still eat a fair amount of carbohydrates. I do a lot of work and I need a lot of fuel. And I think as we talk about the book, maybe we'll talk about some of this. But I don't eat a lot of wheat after about 6 o'clock, just because my body has decided to tell me not to do that. And so I feel better as a result of that too. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've several of us have sort of talked around topics that are personal but related to things that we've read in the second half of the book. The first half of the book was really just sort of laying the foundation of some concepts and pulling some data and looking at some research. And we talked a little bit a month ago that he does a little bit of cherry picking. He has a very specific lens because his focus has been with his experience with diabetics, and so insulin is a particular villain in his story because of that experience. We talked a little bit about how there's a little bit of hypocrisy in some of what he does, because he sort of raked other researchers over the coals for oversimplifying things, and then he turns around and takes a very similar approach and yet it's very simple. It's all about this one thing, right? And I guess and I took note of that as I was listening to the second half of the book for this recording, and it's tricky because, I mean, he does simplify it to the degree that he talks about the major culprit being more hormonal, and he over and over again talks about how it's not just any one hormone or any one thing in your body that's causing obesity, but like every time he goes into an example, it's always insulin, right? He kind of mentions cortisol every now and then, but it's 98% about insulin in his descriptions of things and his discussion of things, even though he's outright admitting that's a overly simplified perspective on the problem of obesity. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, I mean, I saw, I think, a little less of that in the second half than the first half, but yes, I agree. But I think it's also in the reading of it, especially after our discussion last time and the things that Sam was talking to us about hormones, it was easy for me to reread the second half and understand that he's writing mostly about controlling insulin because he has what he believes are answers there. I think in the other places and in the greater complexities, he's less specific about solutions or help or anything like that. And so I think he feels like he's got an answer to the insulin problem, whether that's true or not, or what he perceives to be the problem. Whether that's true or not, we can certainly discuss. But I think that's mostly why he keeps coming back to it, is the structure of the book. We talked about it a little bit last time, I think, but lots of books like this, and this one's definitely it. This is really, he's really got 5 simple things to say, and he breaks down those 5 simple things in the second half. And then he's trying to blow it out to 300 pages for the purpose of publishing. Well, and I think a lot of it is that's the problem.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think some of that is also, like, as an academic, like I see an academic approach to his analysis and his writing that it almost suffers from, right? Because he's not writing to academics, but he's done the academic work, and you know, Sam can speak to his experience. I've only had my experience in terms of getting a PhD, but I was told many times through my doctoral program. I was told many times through my doctoral program that like my writing was too, I don't know if conciliatory is the right word. Like I softened it too much, and I kept getting the message like, no, you need to make bold statements, like you found the solution because that's how you get published and that's how you get noticed. And it's like, yeah, but like that's not the way the world should work. Like we should all be willing to recognize that I don't necessarily have the answers, but here's some things I'm thinking about, you know, and be okay with that. But I can see that in his writing a lot of times too. And it's weird because the writing style is such that I feel like most of the time he's writing to a more general audience, but he's still taking that approach of I need to make bold statements, you know, with big conclusions and get people's attention. And that sometimes hurts the message, I think.
So, sorry, Tracy, did you go ahead?
I was just going to say real quick on the bold statements. One thing I found interesting, though, is that it doesn't feel as bold as some of these, like, self-help type books might be.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Yeah. 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 And I think that's where Jeff's saying it's an academic boldness versus a pure self-help perspective boldness, right? There is a very different writing style there. For me, academically, so that it's funny, Jeff, that you mentioned that because there is that aspect to hard science academic writing as well. You want to be able to say in your abstract, here's the solution, or here's the conclusion we come to based on this data that we've gathered. And you have to be very specific about your statement that you're making. Whether it's bold or not is up for question, but you're saying here's the conclusion because of this data. But then it's expected in the conclusion part of the paper that you wrote that you're, you know, in the discussion part, you're actually saying, well, here's our conclusion based on this data, and here's why we feel like these other 20 studies support that, and why we interpreted that data that way, because it also is supported by this other type of interpretation and this other type of theoretical analysis and all that stuff. You have to support it. So don't take Jeff wrong. Anybody listening who doesn't know about it, he's not saying that you're just making up stuff and blowing a lot of smoke. You're making a bold statement based on data, and then you have to back it up. And the difference between that, like a scientific paper I published, versus what this book is this book can cite things and nobody is I am, but most other people are not reading it and saying, is that what that original study really says that he's citing, right? Which is what happens when you go through a PhD is, yeah, you're citing that. And then your advisor and the rest of your committee and all the other grad students in your lab and your department go, is that what that paper really says? Or did you misinterpret that? And they force you to go make sure that you are doing that correctly. I'm not saying this guy didn't have that experience or didn't have people that tried to hem him in and make sure that everything he said was a valid interpretation. I'm not trying to say he's lying, but it's a very different style when you're writing to turn that academic work into a self-help book versus turning it into an academic paper, right? You know, he didn't publish this in the New England Journal of Medicine. He published it from a publisher. It goes in the self-help nutritional dietary section, right? And so that's why you can get to my bone that I want to pick today, which is the images that I downloaded the supplemental stuff, which is all the graphs that he puts in the book. Now, I've listened to the book on audiobook, and then it gives you the PDF of the images. And I just want to call your attention to say, for example, figure 10.1. Figure 10.1 is not a scientific figure. It's just a frickin' drawing. There's no data in there. It doesn't tell you squat. Okay. Now, I know that in the book, he cites some papers in that chapter. It's figure 10.1 because it's in chapter 10. right? But then figure 10-2, same damn thing. There's nothing. Figure 10-3, same thing. 10-11-1, 12-1 even has some colors, but there's actually no caption on that. There's some of the figures early on that don't even have a y-axis on a graph, right? Figure 15-1 is so there are some inconsistencies with the way that he's even choosing to present the data, which is different from having to change the writing so that it hits a certain audience, right? Like, so there is some. This is why those graphs are related to what we were talking about. There is some sort of putting things in the book to match what the point is.
No, absolutely.
Right. And it's not
Oh,
it's not that those things are a lie. It's just that they've chosen to put certain images and certain graphs in there to the exclusion of other things. And they've chosen to not be very specific in some of the graphs and some of the purported data representation that is not, it doesn't give me a lot of scientific warm fuzzies. I'll put it that way. It's not that it's not true. It's not that he's lying, or obfuscating on purpose. He's trying to, it's one of those where there's let's simplify it so people can understand. But are you now misrepresenting? It keeps coming back to that for me.
And I think a little bit in science type stuff too. It feels like there's a, and correct me if I'm wrong, please. It's what you're trying to say is nothing. You have to prove something true, otherwise you're going to be neutral to saying, you're not saying it's false. You're just going to say it's not necessarily true. So you kind of have to do that proof thing where sometimes people aren't used to being in an environment where, like, if I just make a statement and someone wants to challenge me on it, well, they have to prove I'm wrong rather than me having to prove that I'm true. And he has to prove what he's saying is true, and he probably hasn't fully done that.
Right. But see, I'm a different audience, right? So
right, yeah.
Like I like to say in biology, what I tell my students is we don't prove anything. We never, ever prove anything. What we do is we support our hypothesis or we don't support our hypothesis. And then you can make a conclusion, but you never get to say, I proved this. Right. Because you're not looking for proof.
Right. And it felt to me like the book is more in that hypothesis state, in part because the research isn't great in that area anyway, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of missing stuff.
Well, it's confusing sometimes in his language too, because there are plenty of places, and I actually had a line. It was funny you guys talking about academics. I actually wrote in my notes. I made some notes to talk today. Is that his tone is often condescending to other people's views and other theories, and I put in a way that he writes in a condescending manner toward others' theories as only an academic can, which I know you guys are talking about this. But there's a lot of places
that's
in the book
consistent
where
with what we talked about as well. He's taking that approach where you kind of have to do that a little bit. Like there was a moment that really stood out to me because he took the common phrase that you hear sometimes in the fitness world, I think, that you have to choose the diet that works for you. And then he just...
That's what I was talking about. Yeah.
He tore that apart, but he tore that apart by specifically misinterpreting what that means. Like, because, and then he went on after tearing it apart to then explain, now let me tell you why all those diets don't work and how you need to choose this diet because it will work. But you're telling us to do the exact thing that phrase is saying. You're trying to say there are some, here's some options that might work for you.
And in the middle of that, he says all those diets work equally well.
No, absolutely.
So which is it? Do none of them work, or they all work equally well, or what?
And
that's why
he explains the phrase "choose the diet that works for you" as does that. So that means that if the diet that works for me is eat a dozen donuts every day, then that's the diet I should follow? No, that's ridiculous. And I'm like, nobody has ever said that phrase and meant that. That's ridiculous. Why would you be making that argument other than he's being an academic trying to make a bold statement and nobody's checking, there's no peer review to double check and make sure, wait, does that actually reflect what people mean? No, it's just, anyway, David, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just saying it's just sort of a larger pattern to me to me it falls. It's all kind of one piece. It's a lot of things that are correlation that he talks about, like causation. We talked about that last time, where there's clear correlation, but he's because of he's writing a book in what he feels is colloquial language. He's treating it as causation. He's rejecting letting the perfect be the enemy of the good all the time. He talks about the practicalities of some of the pieces, and then in the next page, we'll say the only way to do it is a more perfect way. And again, I think it's all a symptom of it feels like he's got 5, I think, really constructive things to recommend in taking care of your body, but he's got to present it in such a way that will make money. And it's interesting to me, there's a place in the book, he doesn't say this exactly, but it's in the second half that I had remembered, and I couldn't find the exact statement, but there are a couple things that might have been that. And basically what he's saying is that the things that make you healthy may not be what makes the fitness industry money. And that's part of the reason our diets are what they are is actually helping us be healthy may not make money for the industries that are making money off of us. And I think the book suffers from some of the same of that, in that a compassionate way of explaining to us the 5 things that he thinks we should try to make our lives better probably produces an 80-page book that's not sensational enough to fly off the shelf. And it's only in pushing into hyperbole and a little bit of pseudoscience confusion and things like that he's able to get a publishable book. And that may be the fault of the publisher. That may be the self-help books in general. That may be the fault of the marketplace. That may be the fault of how he understands self-help books should be. But it's interesting that some of the exact same things that he's decrying throughout the book are the traps I think he's falling into as he explains to us. What, again, I think he's got 5 pretty solid recommendations in how you might make yourself feel better, how you might make your body healthy.
Yeah, why don't you tell us what those 5 things are? Because
go ahead. Hold on before we move on. I do want to clarify something. So that one of the reasons why he says that phrase about choose the diet that is right for you, one of the things that he says about why that's not a good way to go is actually a true example. What he says is, we don't do that with any other disease. Diseases are multifactorial. They have multifactorial causes and multiple symptoms. And so when you have a disease, the doctor will try to treat every single piece of that. And so if you have a cancer, they're going to treat you with multiple different types of chemo or radiation therapy or whatever. If you have heart disease, they don't say, pick, here's what could help with heart disease. Pick the one that you feel the best about and do it. No, the doctor says, here are the things you should change to reduce the symptoms and the damage to your heart because you have heart disease. Now you've been diagnosed. And what he was trying to say was that's why it doesn't make sense for someone to say, hey, just pick the diet that works for you, which sounds like a great thing, except he's forgetting the fact that diet it has a lot to do with culture as well. Like diet and what we eat is extremely intertwined with culture. And it has a lot to do with the different things happening in society around you. Everywhere I've ever worked, if somebody has a birthday, someone makes a freaking cake, okay? There's cookies and cakes and stuff all around all the time. That's a cultural thing, okay? When we have birthdays, you get presents and you get a cake. And my mom used to say, well, what meal do you want for your birthday, right? So that's what that's a cultural thing. And there's you have to address that. And that's what the whole sentence about, well, pick the diet that works for you, like the one that makes your body feel the best, the one that you can fit into your schedule, and the one that actually allows you to not refuse to participate in those cultural, social aspects of your life, right? Now, I'm not saying you have to always eat a half a cake every time somebody has a birthday, but you have to be able to, within the confines of your life, choose a way that you're going to be able to adhere to the constraints of the diet. And that's what that phrase means. It doesn't mean that you would do that with heart disease, and when the doctor says, well, you should do these 5 things, that you're going to decide, well, I'm not going to, all those don't work for me, but this one does, so that's all I'm going
Right.
to do. Like that.
Well, but it's actually not 100% true, though. I mean, I have done a lot of work in the healthcare industry as a designer and a software person, and been around a lot of this stuff. And for most therapeutic drugs for non-critical conditions, for the conditions that you're not going to die from, adherence is an enormous problem.
Oh, sure.
Where even if the drugs work, adherence to the drug, it may be difficult. It may be a financial problem. It may be a habit problem. It may be that there's an unpleasant side effect.
But the doctor, for the heart disease specifically, that example, and I only say that because that's what he uses as the example in the book.
Sure.
The doctor will say, here are the things you need to do. The doctor doesn't say, pick the one you want to do or pick the one that works for you. That's his point. And there is a tiny kernel of truth to that underlying everything. And you're right. Yeah, you're not always able to do things, especially if it's a voluntary treatment that you're undergoing. You can't always necessarily fit everything into your schedule. But I guess my whole point is that's kind of a false equivalency to compare how a doctor gives you advice based on heart disease to how a doctor gives you advice based on dieting. Like, why are you even making those two things equal? That is a completely not equal situation to compare, except for the fact that it's got a doctor in both scenarios. Like,
and I think it's again some of that hyperbole that I was saying. And I think Tracy said earlier, it's hard to, because of some of the language and stuff, it's hard to, I don't know what you say, it's hard to trust. It's hard to know where he's coming from. There's enough hyperbole buried in all of this that it makes me skeptical of some of the more reasonable statements. And it makes me, and part of, because I am who I am, part of it makes me go do some research on my own, see if I can find supporting papers that he talks about. Not everybody's going to have that instinct, and I don't have the same tools that you guys have from an academic standpoint to find those things either. But, that kind of hyperbole, it turns me off a little bit, but it also may be, as we were saying before, what sells books. So,
Yeah. And the other part of that, too, is that going back to what type of doctor he is and who he's treating, for a lot of his patients, making these changes would be akin to taking a particular... Well, in fact, he's often suggesting this in the stead of the commonly prescribed medications for diabetes and similar conditions, right? So this isn't, I'm changing my lifestyle because just for purely personal reasons. It's usually to treat a particular condition. But I also agree with you that part of the reason I wanted to have the book club about this book is I read it and I was like, some of this stuff feels right. I don't know if it feels right because I want it to be right. In terms of, my brother's a type 1 diabetic, my parents are type 2, I have type 2 for a few years. The cycle of medication for type 2s just never felt good to me. And the fact that they keep pushing, and then I went through a pregnancy where they're like, you have to take this insulin, but also be it's going to likely cause weight gain, but you can't gain any weight, and stuff like that. So just trying to understand what is really going on, and thus how can I really fix it without, particularly when you look at a lot of the type 2 medication, and even insulin itself, the prices have just been skyrocketing over the last few years. Hopefully, thinking through, is there a different way we could approach this, and what is causing this increase, if anything is? And then reading this, and then because it was recommended to me, and then seeing the hyperbole, and particularly if you read the audiobook, the person reading it really digs into some of this hyperbole and exasperates it. So I don't know, I just wanted to be able to talk through them a little bit more with people who had a background on it.
We've spent now 2 months discussing this book and largely being super critical of this book, and I think that's
we're nerds.
And exactly, no, we are nerds, and that's kind of the premise of the show, right?
That's what we do.
But we were super, and I think it's really fair to be super critical of the first half, because it's just him laying the groundwork in this very sort of cherry-picked, hyperbolic sort of way, right? In the second half, that those problems continue to exist. But as David sort of mentions, he does lay out some fairly reasonable suggestions, and I think there's things in this book, and I took I listened to the different sort of suggestions that he made, and sort of zoomed in on, I think, sort of three things. I'm like, I could probably do these things without significant issue, and see if that has an impact sort of on my health. But David, you said that there were five. So why don't you run us through the five? Because
there's sort of five dietary things and a couple of behavior things. But I guess what I'd say is the first thing I want to say is I think when we counsel people at Hero's Journey and in other practices we've been part of, an important part of lifestyle change, and this would definitely be nutrition change. Like this is definitely lifestyle change. It affects, it affects your life, how you shape your life, how you shop, how you spend your money, how you cook your food, so that kind of change is difficult change, especially for adults, and not because of some deficiency in us, but because our lives are structured for lots of reasons, kids, money, all of that, and changing fundamental pieces of that structure is hard. And so the thing I would say is I think one of the things I appreciated about the book, the way it was structured, and I don't know how much it was hammered home in the audiobook, but it's structured sort of as, here's a progression of things, not do these all at once, but rather do this first and then do this. And I really appreciated that, because it's how we counsel as well. Making change one step at a time is how change lasts. Making, wholesale change is how you, as Sam was saying, how you burn out. That's how you burn out on change. And so I appreciated that. And so the steps were sort of starting with reducing your sugar intake. And I like the word reduce. I do not like how much time he spends on the idea of sugar toxicity, which drives me crazy. Sugar is not a toxic substance. Heavy metals are a toxic substance. Sugar is not a toxic substance, but it is ubiquitous in our food because of a bunch of decisions made in our society in the 80s. It's we bring in a whole lot more of it than we need to, and reducing it. I think I'll say, just as a side note, interestingly, the things the 5 steps are pretty universal to, I think, any solid fitness and health program, despite his protestation that his is a unique solution. But that aside, reducing your sugar intake, great. It's easy to do in the beginning. I'm in sort of that beginning stage, not buying as much candy, not having it around, not eating candy or donuts or cookies, or reducing that greatly. That's an easier thing. When you start having to read labels and parse, 1 can of spaghetti sauce versus another by a 1 gram sugar difference, I would argue you may be causing yourself more anxiety than you're actually helping yourself in reducing sugar when you get to that point. But reducing sugar, I think, generally for most of us in our diets is a really good first step. And spending the time to be actually successful and feel successful, feel changes in your body, and feel like you got this in lock is an important part of this too. It's not just 1 week reducing sugar and then moving on. It's, I feel like I have reduced sugar. I also, when we counsel people, we don't tell them not to worry about the sugar that's in fruit, in large part because you're getting so many good things out of fruit, vitamins and fiber and everything, that we would rather have you eating fruit than not. So, but that's, again, not when we're counseling diabetic people necessarily. That's a different, sort of equation. But generally speaking, reducing your sugar intake is good. The next step that he has after that is reducing refined grains. It's a little trickier, I think, when you get into reducing refined grains. It's a much harder thing to do. A lot of our lives are built around bread. Fundamentally, that's sort of the building blocks of why our civilization is shaped like it is, for better or for worse. So once you get into here, it starts to be, I think, trickier and harder. And I think the word reduce is important. There are certainly extreme diets where you're eliminating this stuff entirely, and that works for some people and not for others, and it can be dangerous for some. But reducing it, again, is probably something we can all do, assuming that we are of a socioeconomic status that allows us to get enough calories to sustain our bodies with the reduction of refined grains. And he talks about that a little bit. I think about the fact that cheap food is carbohydrate-laden food, and super processed food, and that's a reality of a lower socioeconomic status. But he does not really make space in his theory to adjust that for people who can't afford to not be taking in those extra calories because that's where they can afford to get them. So that's why I say it starts to become a more complex situation when we get into this reduced refined grains. But the reduced word, I think, is important to the level in which your lifestyle and your social stuff and the way your family eats and the way your culture eats allows, if rice is a better option than white bread if you can. If you like, I eat white bread on a fairly regular basis, but in lower quantities. I have a nostalgic feeling for Wonder Bread, and so I eat it because I like it, but I eat it in lower quantities. Once we're beyond there, he says moderate protein. And I appreciate you guys let me talk through this because I've got a bunch of notes in these steps here. Moderate protein is an interesting thing to say because he does talk about some ratios in your diet, and he talks a lot about what we think of in the nutrition field a little bit as traditionally more of a golden ratio of your diet, which is about a third of your calories from carbohydrates, about a third from protein, about a third from fats. And we're looking in a fitness world where people are doing a lot of activity and building their bodies in certain ways. But he does say that 25 to 30% protein is about all you need, and I think that's true for most of us. But I also want to point out that I don't think overeating protein is generally a problem, even though like keto diets are sort of in vogue in the margins of our society, and even though there's lots of talk about protein drinks and protein shakes and stuff, the reality is if you're eating a 2,000 calorie diet, and I eat a much higher calorie diet than that, I expend a lot more energy, and on days especially I work out, I'm eating 3,000 or 3,500 calories, but a 2,000 calorie diet, which is sort of the normal we're all used to dealing with, 33% protein is 150 grams of protein. That's an enormous amount of protein. I try to make sure I'm putting between 150 and 200 in my body a day, but I'm also trying to grow muscle and things, and I'm getting older, so I need extra at certain points of the day and stuff, and I know that about my body and because of my training, but on base, 150 grams of protein a day is like 1.5 pounds of hamburger a day. And so just being afraid, sorry, Tracy.
I was just going to say, and I think you might be going there, talking real quick about that cost thing, because I was doing that for a while from January till about March, April.
Yeah.
It's expensive, and
Super
either
expensive.
You need a lot of freezer space, or you're constantly buying a ton at the grocery store. Sorry, I just thought you...
No, don't be sorry. It's because it's true, and I guess that's kind of my point. Is I don't know that moderate protein is something that needs to be in this stack, because I don't think a large amount of Americans who this is aimed at are consuming more than that 150 grams of protein a day, because it, as you say, Tracy, it's hard to do. It's costly, even if you're doing protein shakes and stuff as well as meat products, or if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, it's even harder. It's costly. It takes a lot of effort and thought to make sure you're putting that much protein in your body. I just don't think this is the problem maybe that he thinks
is. Is it really just in there as his way of sort of trying to steer people away from like an Atkins diet or a keto style diet or something? It's just his way of backing into it.
The thing is that protein, my understanding from my remembrance is that protein has, compared to fat calories, still has that insulin response. It might not be quite the same as carbohydrate, but it's still pretty high up there. So the idea of the moderating the protein is to reduce the insulin response.
Yeah, but again, I think when he does call it out, he does say that, and then he says you should kind of top your ceiling at 25. I just wanted to point out again that ceiling that he posts in there, that's an enormous amount of protein, and so I don't think a lot of us anyway are in danger of breaking that. And those of us that are, I mean, again, I'm eating more protein than that typically. You're doing that. You're sort of forcing protein for specific purposes and not, to the general population. And then beyond that, increasing natural fats, which I think is a pretty common dietary advice, increasing good oils and omega-3 fatty acids and olive oils and things like that. It seems a reasonable thing to put in there, For in cooking and stuff, you can cook with olive oil instead of I've lost my ability to remember what the corn oil substitutes are. Anyway, the cooking with natural oils, adding that to your diet, that seems reasonable. Shouldn't be too hard a thing to do. And then the last one is increasing fiber and vinegar. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit with the group, but increasing fiber, I think, is one of the critical pieces of all of this, and one of the hardest things societally for us to deal with, because it relies upon eating a lot of eating whole grains and whole fruits and whole vegetables, which is harder financially, which is harder time-wise, which is harder depending upon where you are in the country. I grew up in North Dakota, where it's better now for fresh fruits and vegetables, but in the winter, please, it's just not happening. And so I think it's great advice, and most of us do not eat enough fiber. And there's lots of things that fiber do for us in our body that we know. But it was also interesting to me for it to be in this list for the reasons he put it in here. And then I wanted to ask the group about the vinegar stuff, because I don't have the academic background in this to deeply parse how he talks about vinegar, but he talks about vinegar as curbing the insulin response in general. But it's very clear that he says there's not it's not well understood the mechanisms by which this happens, and that always makes me suspicious when that becomes part of a diet book. Is this seems to work, we don't know why, which is a perfectly fine statement to say, but then to put it as part of your primary recommendation stack was strange to me.
And as I recall, he even said with the vinegar thing, he cited a study that said it showed an impact, but even then it showed a relatively small, barely statistically significant impact. So he's suggesting it, he's putting it on his list, and he talks about it a lot. But he's also saying because it seems to help, although not really that much, So
yeah. So it might not be a bad idea. I don't have a lot of exposure in the trainings that I've had to vinegar as a solution. I've seen it, obviously in the holistic wellness world, but I don't know. Unlike the rest of the recommendations that were in his stack, the broad recommendations, which are all part of my training and part of, I think, almost anyone's nutrition training, if you take that, this was the one that was sort of an outlier for me as far as the eating stuff.
So there is a study in 2004 that showed a at least statistically significant difference in insulin sensitivity if vinegar was ingested with a high carbohydrate meal. So if you incorporate a vinegar component into a meal that has maybe higher than what you would normally have carbohydrate, or what might be normal for you carbohydrate load in that meal, if you also now start ingesting vinegar or some vinegar component, the vinegar helps increase supposedly insulin sensitivity. So even if you're a type 2 diabetic, because that's who the patients in the study were type 2 diabetics, if you're a type 2 diabetic and you have insulin resistance, ingesting vinegar in some amount, I'd have to look up the actual, I looked it up at the one point, but ingesting vinegar with that meal, somehow within the 60 minutes post meal, you have a lower amount of insulin. You have an increased insulin sensitivity, so lowered insulin resistance, which means that even though you ate a high carbohydrate meal, because your body is not responding with your, quote, typical insulin resistance as a type 2 diabetic, then you actually didn't increase your blood glucose too much. You're not putting as much strain on your metabolic system as you would have if you had not ingested the vinegar with it. And the reason the study could be published is because the results were statistically significant. Now, how much of a difference does that make? I don't remember how long that study was, but like most dietary studies, they almost never go for more than a couple of months, right? So I don't know. I would have to actually look that paper up again. But because I thought the same thing, like what the heck does vinegar have to do with it? And because the actual mechanism is relatively unknown, I can't even answer that part of it.
So what I'm really hearing, though, is that the British really stumbled on fortuitously a really lucky thing with fish and chips, right? Because they douse it.
Well, he points out. Yeah. He points out the Mediterranean diet specifically because they eat a lot of oil and vinegar as part of their. Dipping your bread in oil and vinegar seems like the exact solution that we were just talking about. And then the other two pieces that he has beyond those 5 steps are, and I think we should talk about this broader because I know some of you are practicing this, are fasting. Mm-hmm. And then I really loved that there was a big piece on meditation later in the book in one of the appendices as help with cortisol regulation and things. So, but I think he treats, though he gives these 5 steps, which are, I think, very reasonable and I think very achievable because of the words like reduce and moderate and increase, which are very, I think, gentle and usable terms in this state. He's got this really, I think, wonderful when you get to it, advice about how to eat, and then he talks about fasting, which is a interesting, I think, overall mechanism, but and a lot of what goes into his fasting, although there's some more extreme things that he talks about, a lot of it in the beginning of his conversation boils down to don't eat when you're not hungry, which is one of the hardest pieces of advice that we give in our world, because it's hard for people to learn their bodies well enough, to listen to their bodies well enough to know when you're actually hungry versus thirsty versus bored versus everything else. It's all wrapped up together, so it's hard to learn those things. But ultimately, eating when you're hungry is great advice. Whether you choose to practice, some form of fasting or not, that's great advice. And it goes both ways too. After you finish a crazy hard workout, or Jeff, after you run your 3 miles, if your body tells you you're hungry, you should eat, even if it's not, specifically mealtime. After you've exerted yourself in that way, feeding yourself is the right thing to do. In the same way that if you're not hungry, you shouldn't eat. And
I think part of it too is we haven't talked too much about the kind of, like, in some ways we have, but the overall narrative, from my understanding of having read the book, is more about, we have been trained not to listen to our bodies. There has been this huge thing about snacking in particular. That's one of the ones he talks about a lot, and how we've been kind of pushed to continuously eat throughout the day. And then his narrative is that what's happening with that is that our insulin levels go up and they stay up, and then our body creates this insulin resistance response, because it would be devastating if we kept trying. So insulin tries to get the calories, in his narrative at least, into the cells, right? Keeps stuffing them, and then the cells fill up. They don't need any more, but we still produce the insulin because it's in the blood sugar, and so insulin resistance crops up, and then we create a whole lot of, I'll just call it hurt, and so and that's like the narrative of the book. And it was Sam and I had been talking between ourselves a week or so ago about it, and I had made the comment that it feels kind of like Marie Kondo, but for your body, because the reality is, like, our liver is storing a bunch of stuff, our cells have a bunch of stuff stored, there's nowhere to put our clothing, and so it's all over our bed or on the floor or everywhere else. And the book, whether or not it works, the narrative is trying to clean that stuff out so that there's now room for the more natural pathways to happen for where calories are going to go and stuff like that.
And that actually leads into why he says fasting works, because the problem with insulin, so insulin resistance, basically the way it works is, remember when we talked about hormones last time, I said it goes through the blood, it gets released, it goes through the bloodstream, and it acts on target cells, and the target cells have to have these little receptors on them that can attach to the insulin, and then it causes a change in the cell. And in this case, the change in the cell is the cell now takes in glucose and some sodium, and then will use or store that glucose. Okay, and what happens is, when there's insulin around all the time, the cell's getting overstimulated. And so it self-moderates by removing those receptors from the cell, from the outside of the cell. So now, even though there's insulin there, the cell itself can't even get that message. It's like removing your front door. Well, if you don't have a front door, how is somebody going to knock on your front door or ring your doorbell? They can't. You're never going to hear their message. You're never going to see that there's somebody out there, because nobody rang your doorbell, right? How do you know when to answer your phone? Because it rings. Well, if you turn off the ringer, guess what? Unless you're looking at your phone, you don't know that somebody tried to call you. That's what insulin resistance is. The cell isn't able to see that there's a signal out there. So the body keeps pumping out insulin because you keep eating. And that was the problem with snacking, that it keeps your insulin never drops enough to stop the insulin resistance from occurring. Because what happens is, if insulin drops enough, those cells will now say, oh, I'm underworked. I'm going to put some more receptors into the plasma membrane so that now when insulin's around, I can listen to it. Well, if you never, ever have a low amount of insulin, your cells will never go back to their sort of quote natural state of having the quote right amount. And no, I'm putting quotes because you remember what I said. This is way more complex than this, right? There's a lot more signaling going on. But let's pretend, because he does, this way, if your insulin goes low enough because you're fasting, which is a natural response, right? The reason why I think his fasting theory is intriguing to me is because he uses an evolutionary argument. He says the human body is built to have different periods of fasting and feasting. And so you're okay surviving a fast, and actually your body is more normal than it might have ever been in the modern world if you fast, because that's how we survived all those millennia ago when it wasn't necessary. There were no supermarkets to go to, and if there was a big snowstorm, you were just in the cave for a week and you didn't eat because the food ran out and you can't go out and hunt, and there's nothing out there anyway because they're all hiding in their caves too, right? So that argument on a very Fred Flintstone, anthropomorphic geek, ecology geek level, really, I mean, look, that's not evolution, right? But the idea appeals to evolution, and because I'm a biologist and I had to take a lot of evolution classes, like, I understand why he's framing that argument that way, and it does make some weird sort of sense. There's no proof of it, right? But it makes sense intrinsically, right? There's only so many saber-toothed tigers to go hunt and kill. There's only so many buffalo, and they're not just standing there waiting for you to come hunt them when there's a snowstorm. So sometimes you're not going to have food. So in order for the human species to survive, at some point we had to have effects in us that allow us to survive fasting. And therefore, all that can be true. But now he takes the leap into the modern world and says, okay, now because of that, that means that right now, the best thing for you to do in your diet is fast periodically.
Yeah,
and that will reset your whole system,
and
your
that's
whole
interesting.
metabolism.
I know. I think I may have mentioned once upon a time that I had this book in my Audible library because my wife read it years ago, and it sort of began a lot of her own fitness journey, and she's gone to she's not keto to the point that she's counting carbs or whatever. She's just cut all added carbs and sugars from her diet entirely, and that's working for her, and that's great. She's lost a bunch of weight. She feels better, and so that's going great for her. And this book was sort of the beginning of her walking onto that journey. And so, because of that, I already had some exposure to the fasting thing, and she got me to try it for a while, and I maintained it for a while. And the big issue for me is I really like bacon and eggs, and it's no better time in the day to eat it than breakfast, in the morning. But what
and you have an academic life because you teach, so your morning is very early in the morning.
It can be, yeah, absolutely. So I mean, and that's going to fit into what my goals I think are for the coming week, is sort of what I'm taking out of this conversation and what I'm understanding from the book. But before we talk about the goals, I did have one other question, and it was kind of mentioned. David mentioned that one of the things that he suggests is increasing fiber, and how that's kind of a no-brainer. It's been commonly stated within the fitness world and nutrition world for a long time, and I've heard it over and over and over again over the years. And there are ways of increasing that fiber and the kinds of foods you can eat, and it's hard for us to get that in our natural diets and whatever. I'm curious what people think about fiber supplements. So he had, and I was a little surprised, he had explicitly at one point suggested, and if necessary, maybe even use Metamucil, right? It is impossible, I have discovered, to buy Metamucil that is not loaded with sugar, with added sugars, So I was a little surprised at that suggestion, but I have discovered that there is a product called Benefiber, which is just the fiber with nothing else, and it still sort of dissolves in your. I put a couple scoops in my or spoonfuls in my morning tea, and it just sort of disappears. I don't even notice it's there. But I'm curious what people think about that in terms of a way to increase fiber, and if that is as effective as just eating more broccoli or whatever.
I see no reason that it should be bad. It's just soluble fiber ground up so you can dissolve it in water and stuff. I guess I don't understand why it would be bad. It's, my wife is really good about it. She's a strength athlete, and so she does lots of things right, and other things. We all are human. But one of the things that she does is she's really good about her fiber. Her body feels better, and she's experienced this when she has the right amount of fiber. She uses psyllium husks that she mixes into. She buys like would buy Metamucil and mix into her tea or whatever. But I guess I don't know why a supplement would be bad. Bad is a relative word. Who doesn't have morality? I don't know why a supplement would be not appropriate for this. Maybe unless, as you say, it's loaded with sugar and you're trying to keep that down. But when you say loaded with sugar, is it 1 gram or 2? I mean, ultimately, is it enough sugar to be hurting you? I don't know. I think it's sometimes when you get on the sugar train, and especially when places that are calling it toxic and stuff, you end up quibbling over a gram of sugar versus 20 grams of fiber, and maybe that's a pretty
I don't know how much there is, but I know my wife is no added sugars, so I look for that on I look at
Sure.
you talked about if you're getting to the point that you're looking at the nutrition labels for a gram of sugar here and there, that maybe you're going too far. I do that when I go grocery shopping for her, right? I when I buy pasta, I don't look at the grams, but I look at the ingredient list, and if there's added sugar or sugar equivalents, right, then I buy the other pasta sauce, right?
Well, and if she feels good doing that, and she hasn't ratcheted up her anxiety in the process, that's great. And it's a little bit what we talked about weighing yourself. I have plenty of clients and people that I train and people that I know who are the kind of nerd who a spreadsheet is the thing that brings them the most comfort, and weighing themselves every day actually brings them comfort, because that's the response they have to it. To a lot of us, especially if we're battling our weight, that brings us anxiety, and so that's part of why I recommend not doing it every day. If looking at added sugars, even a gram at a time, doesn't bring your wife anxiety and instead brings her a better feeling body, fucking do that. It's when you trade sugar for anxiety about and shame. That's when I worry that maybe you're not helping yourself as much.
So
I want to point out there is sugar-free Metamucil, and but sugar-free Metamucil.
But have you looked at the list? Because when I found sugar-free Metamucil, it had fake sugar in it.
Sugar-free Metamucil has maltodextrin in it, which is not fake sugar. It is a polysaccharide. It's a natural sugar, so it is a carbohydrate, but it's not an added sugar. Okay, so that's where, this is where this is why reading labels will make you crazy, because there's a lot of things in there that are natural, that they don't count as added sugars because they are natural products or whatever, but that are still carbohydrates, and that depending on how they're absorbed will add to your glucose index, right? Whereas maltodextrin does not, but it sounds like all heck like it would, because it is a carbohydrate, but because of the way it's absorbed in the small intestine, it doesn't have the same effect as like a high load, high glycemic whatever. So the thing is, the question is, do you want to go no sugar at all, or are you going, well, I'm just paying attention to and making sure I don't, if it had sucralose in it, I'd say absolutely not, don't eat it, right? But like I said, this is why it drives you crazy, because who knows what, it's impossible for most people to read a label and tell, because there's also no artificial sugars, except then you read the label, it's got 12 artificial sugars in it. It's just that they're not categorized as artificial by the food chemical business, because they made it to be based on a natural product. So now they call it, it's not artificial, it's natural, but it's made in a lab, just right. So there's this whole, there's a whole list of things in there that the food chemical industry, they can create things, call them natural when they actually were created in a lab.
The good news is that because of my wife asking me about it because of her dietary needs, I was able to find another equivalent product that had one ingredient on the list, and it was just the fiber. So it ends up sort of solving that problem, and it's equivalent in price, in usage and everything. So that worked out okay in terms of all of that.
Would it be okay to
And
talk
like I
about
said, I recommend. Oh, sorry, Tracy.
Oh, I was just gonna say I was gonna talk about the breakfast thing real quick, but we can finish the fiber conversation first if we want.
All I was going to say is, if you're looking for something too, if psyllium husk is a good source of soluble fiber that's really inexpensive. You can order it on wherever you would find food, and sometimes find it at the grocery store. But mostly, you probably have to order it. But that's a good alternative to anything. It's just literally psyllium husks.
On the breakfast thing, when I remember when I first read this book and he was like, you can skip breakfast and just start your day with a nice salad and salmon, I was like, no way, I cannot do this. I love my egg scrambles. I put all of this quote unquote good stuff in it, and why would I ever change this? And then I did eventually start doing the fasting thing, and I started with the 12 to 14 hours, which actually you can still eat 3 full meals if you want. A lot of the times with that, you're just, making sure you're not doing late night snacking, which for some people is a problem that they're trying to battle for them. And then over time, I was just like, maybe I don't need that breakfast every day. And that's another thing that he points out. I don't know if he does it as much in this book as I also read the diabetes code that he produced later. And the main thing with the intermittent fasting for him is you don't have to do the same schedule every day of the week. So if you think like, if it was something you ever wanted to try and you felt like 5 days of your bacon and eggs is great, but 2 days you could go without it, that's another way you could approach it, or anyone else who's interested. And I found that that was the part where that flexibility, where he wasn't just selling you a specific plan, and then thus the binder you can buy and the online classes and seminars and stuff like that as much, made me think that maybe this wasn't meant to extract the most amount of money possible from me. It made me think through more of the stuff that he was offering.
And the language is adaptive to your circumstances. I like that he does talk about that in this book as well. And it's to me, it's the same thing as the language of reduce and moderate and increase. They're adaptive words. They're not prescriptive. They're not telling you can't. They're not telling you must. It's one of the things I really like about this book is it's encouraging you, despite saying that choosing the diet that works for you is stupid. He's actually encouraging you to choose the diet that works for you by using these adaptive words that let you, like, as you say, Tracy, take what you can fit into your life. Build a habit slowly. Really take the concept as something useful and then apply it to your life as you may. That's important, I think, and that's one of the things I like about it.
And I think that's because I have a response to that, but it kind of blends right into sort of my goals for the next month. So, and I think we're at like an hour and 22 minutes long on the stream, and so it's probably time to start talking about our goals for the next month and wrapping things up at this point. And I think, in my mind, one of my goals for the next week isn't necessarily to fast per se, but I liked the message of, especially in the morning for breakfast, don't eat unless or until you're hungry, right? Because we're so much in the habit of you wake up in the morning and you eat. And I have found, and then the other end of that is that don't eat after dinner, right? So there's no snacking after dinner and there's no eating until you're hungry in the morning. And I've been doing this for a few days now, maybe a week or so. And it's like right now I feel kind of like I did last night. I'm actually hungry. I want to go have a snack, but I'm not going to because it's after dinner. But I also find that when I wake up in the morning, I'm not hungry. And I can, I'll wake up at 7 in the morning, and then I don't start feeling really hungry until like 9 or 10, and then I'll eat. And then, and so I end up kind of, I've decided I'm going to start tracking the time a little bit just to see, am I pulling off like a 14-hour fast or more some days, or not, without even necessarily trying, by just, don't eat breakfast until I'm hungry and don't eat after dinner. So that's one of my goals. I'm going to try to get back more into meditation. I'm glad that you'd mentioned that, David, that as part of the book. I've been doing that with my kids through the summer, but we've kind of slowed down and it's fallen off the list fairly regularly. So I'm going to try to get that in at like 3 times a week with them. And then continue my no weighing in and continue my running at least 2 to 3 times a week is my goal at this point. So those are my goals for the next month. Who wants to talk about theirs next?
I can go next. My big step now is, now that I feel confident in the reduction of my sugar intake, in the external sugars, I'm moving to artificial sweeteners, which I consume an enormous amount of because I'm a Diet Coke junkie. And so, again, I think reducing is the key word here. I'm not going to stop drinking Diet Coke because that's just craziness. A couple of things for me is, first, I drink a lot of it, and I have an excess of caffeine intake because of it, which is not great for my stomach, among other things. And the artificial sweeteners are, I think, at this point, holding me back a little bit from changing my diet. My cravings remain. I'm just replacing them right now. I don't have the science in me to talk about the glycemic response or the insulin response to artificial sweeteners. I only have what I've read in books and stuff, so I won't. And I've read lots of conflicting things, but I know I am better when I reduce that intake. So that's my next step, is the artificial sweetener reduction. That's a big part of me moving into a more balanced nutrition for myself.
Great. Tracy, Sam?
Tracy?
Sure. I think I'm going to try to continue ramping back up my move goals for most days. I don't think I'm at the point yet where I can commit to exercise minutes, like as in this is an exercise that I'm concentrating on, sort of thing, only because schedules, particularly with trying to buy a house, are a little erratic and long. So I think just moving and getting it in throughout the day is mainly what I'm going to concentrate on. And because I'm going to be going back and forth to New York and here, even trying to concentrate on my what I'm eating is a little harder because I'm not going to have my pantry, and I'm going to be limited. I'm staying with my parents, so I'm limited to what they have. So I think it's going to be more of a let's just keep in the place that I'm at for a while until after we buy the house and move, and then I can make some of the changes I had previously made. I can reintroduce them again.
All right, Sam, you're up.
My main goal is to increase the fasting time for the individual bouts of fasting and figure out what's the best amount for me. And so that's going to be probably a month-long process because I'm going to have to try it for a week and then extend more for a week and then extend again. And then if it's too much, then I got to go back. You know what I mean? So it's a trial and error kind of thing because I don't want to make myself too tired. And I also, one of the complaints I have about the book, and it's kind of a complaint, but it's a sort of collateral complaint. He's talking about eating and food this entire time, but he never addresses, as far as I can remember, and maybe I didn't get to listen to like the last appendices portions, so maybe he did address this and I didn't get there yet. I've got like an hour left. He doesn't address anorexia or any other eating disorder at any point in time in this entire thing, but yet he's talking about fasting as a major component of what he's suggesting. And so I feel like, I'm not saying he has to have 5 chapters on it, but just a couple of pages about, how if you're a type of person who has had an eating disorder or you have other sort of chronic habit disorders like OCD or even depression, depending on how you manifest your symptoms, that could lead to you just taking your issues and pushing them into the food realm, and then you fast, and suddenly you fast and fast and fast, and you're anorexic. And there's other things there. I'm not trying to simplify it. It's a very complex illness, and it has a lot to do with body dysmorphia and things like that. But there is a component there where some people are more susceptible to that than others. And I almost feel like he's a little flippant and breezy with his recommendation to fast.
It would have been nice for him to acknowledge sort of, here are the kinds of people that this advice may not work for. And it didn't even have, I don't know that it would even have to be a couple of pages, but like a paragraph where he just says that, maybe even in the introduction, like, hey, I'm going to give you some advice, and this might not work for you if this applies to you, you know?
Well,
I think bigger acknowledgement would be nice, yeah.
Yeah, what he would need to do is say, these are real disorders.
Right.
This is not just a psychosomatic, somebody thinks they're, whatever. These are real disorders. So therefore, just like any other medical issue, it's possible you might need to see a doctor and or a therapist if you start losing control of how you manifest these suggestions in your life, right? And
I have a whole... Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have a whole section of my notes that we didn't get to because we didn't talk about this really till the end, and I saw we were running super long. But I have a whole... I'm with you, Sam, on this. I have a whole bunch of conversations I would like to have around fasting. Ultimately, maybe with this group would be great. Not necessarily that they're bad or anything, but a discussion around it. I like you, Sam, think that treating it as a sort of a magic key has a potential danger. It's super useful for a lot of people. There are lots of complications around it. And I think a lot of it has to do with our relationship with food writ large, which is one of the things that my wife, Christy, who's a nutrition trained as well as a strength coach and stuff, likes to talk about a lot. So eventually, if we're ever able to come on as guests together, she may, or she by herself, of course, she has lots to say about that too. But I think, Sam, it's a really, as we leave here, it's a really important point. I don't think we should see fasting as inherently dangerous, but as we talk about it, we must be conscious of what diet culture has done, especially to women in our society, but to everybody writ large. For the past 40 years, we have the baggage of all of that whenever we're talking about how much you eat, how many calories you eat, when you eat. Whenever we talk about that, we're carrying that baggage, and if we don't acknowledge that, that's dangerous.
And that's a little bit why I'm kind of disappointed he never addressed it, because he spends a lot of time on talking about how our thoughts in American society evolved, our thoughts about food evolved between the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and now here we are today. And here's, he talks a little bit about all these societal causes and blah, blah, blah. And he never addresses something that is a major problem for young women and some young men. It's not specific to one gender, although it does tend to, manifest in one gender more than another. But this is a societal problem, but it's an addiction problem. And when you start talking about food as an addiction, it's different from smoking. Look, I smoked for 14 years and I quit, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But one of the things I could do is completely remove myself from cigarettes. I don't have to be in the presence of cigarettes. I don't have to buy a cigarette. I don't have to have a lighter on me at any time whatsoever. I don't have to do any of that. But food, if you're addicted to food or you're addicted to a pattern with your food, you can't just stop eating forever. And that itself is a problem if you stop eating forever, right? So I feel like it's a big enough thing that he should have at least mentioned it as a medical doctor. I wanted to say that because I think that's a major important thing. And since fasting and insulin response is his main points, and yeah, he has those other 5 things about diets, and he makes a sort of flippant comment about, moderation and everything is a stupid saying, and then his 5 points are moderation in these things, right? Because his point is, well, you wouldn't say you should eat the same amount of donuts as broccoli. That's why moderation in all things is a stupid saying. But that's not how anybody ever means it. So he kind of takes, it's one of those hyperbolic things again. But then his 5 main points about what you eat are all about moderation, right? And then fasting. And to be fair, he also says fast in moderation. He doesn't say everybody should go on a 30-day fast and that's going to solve all your problems. You're going to suddenly get skinny. He doesn't say that ever at any point. But he does say that fasting is an important component that you might want to think about incorporating into what you're doing. And to not address that major medical and psychological issue is a real giant hole for me. Like the other things that I've complained about, I can totally overlook those things because I understand this is a medically based self-help book and all that. But this is really tough for me to get to the end and not see anything about
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. So that was a nice and I think very important rant in the middle of the discussion of your goals. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, sorry.
But your goal is to
It's stress
Absolutely,
relieving, right?
absolutely.
So
Yeah,
we're
that
not.
totally
So-
is. Yeah, my cortisol level
there
just
you
went
go.
way down. It's
Excellent.
awesome.
So I think that's a place where we're going to have to call it for this month. If you have questions, you can find the show on Facebook, which right now, in the month of July, is running a contest where you can win a bunch of cool dice. You could also find us on Twitter. The show is at The Tome Show. You can also email the Tome Show at thetomeshow@gmail.com. You can find us on Discord. Ask us for that Discord link at any time. We have our own D&D fitness channel there where there's a lot of people there that sort of post every day or two sort of what they're doing and how their journey is going. And so that's particularly relevant here, and I can happen to tell you
And
that I'm
can
pretty... Go ahead.
we shout out to Lewis Brinton, who got a rowing machine or has a rowing machine and has just been
He's been killing it. Yeah,
killing
Lewis, who you might know from the Tome Show News, as well as Jay Sloan.
A-Dot,
From,
yeah.
well, she did.
They've been killing it
Yeah.
too. Yeah,
So,
they did the art for all the Tome Show
yeah,
art.
they did, and
It's all
they're
Jay.
on an episode of the first episode of Side Quest that hasn't come out yet. So that's a thing as well. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, and maybe joining up with that Discord channel sooner rather than later might be a good idea in case, say, August's contest was based on our Discord channel and you could win some cool dice there. Anyway, if you want to reach us in...
Solid. Very subtle,
no,
Jeff.
I try
Yes.
to be... having worked with 12-year-olds for much of my career, that's where my level of subtlety is at. Each of us can also be reached on Twitter. I am at Squatch, Squach. Tracy is...
At Sarah Dark Magic with an
There you
H.
go. Sam is...
At DM Samuel, no spaces.
And David?
At David Net, 2 T's on the end, no spaces.
Very good. And that's sort of where our fitness quest is right now. So please come and join along with us as we build up our geekiness and our health. The end. All right. I'm going to say goodbye to the stream. I've been watching as we've slowly been losing some people there anyway, as we got later and later. But there's a few people left, so goodbye, folks. Thanks for joining us.